Does China now have a president for life? The country saw it coming, the lifting of term limits for Xi Jinping, especially after the president refrained from designating an heir apparent at last fall's Communist Party Congress, a Congress that cemented his status as China's most powerful ruler since Mao. Is the country now heading for one-man rule and a new cult of personality? At 64, he's still young in the eyes of a party that's run, well, mostly by old men. So far, he's only had to deal with a light sprinkling of satirical quips, quickly erased from social media. Does today's world make strongman rule easier or harder? How emboldened will Xi be on the world stage? To get citizens to rally around his flag, should we expect an even more forceful foreign policy? If so, how will the likes of France, the UK, and the United States react? Today in the France24 Debate, we're asking, could Xi Jinping be the new Mao? And with us, Alice Ekman, head of China research at IFRI, who has just published in French, China in the World. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
We want to welcome from Washington, Sun Yun, a senior associate at the East Asia program for the Stimson Center think tank. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
From Moscow, journalism professor and commentator Wu Fei. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Ajaccio on the French island of Corsica, André Lozikrug-Petrie, founder of A Capital, commentator on Chinese affairs. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
The France24 Debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24Debate. The decision set to be rubber-stamped in the coming weeks, a lifting of term limits that for critics raises the specter of one-man rule. Julia Kim has more.
President for life. China's leader Xi Jinping could stay in power indefinitely following the ruling Communist Party's proposal to scrap term limits. The prospect of indefinite rule has earned him the nickname Emperor Xi among China's social media users. But the government says the move is in line with China's political system and the will of its people.
I suggest that you bear in mind the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, and view these amendments to the Constitution in a positive manner. As for the guessing and speculation in the media, I hope you can heed the call of the Chinese people.
At present, China's president can serve no more than 2 consecutive terms. This was established in the 1982 Constitution, abolishing a centuries-old tradition of lifetime rule. Xi is almost certain to be appointed to a second 5-year term in early March, and to more terms beyond, a move that's prompted concern.
The power of Xi Jinping has become continuously consolidated, and of course, there is the concern about whether he will slide into a kind of fascism or personal dictatorship.
The 64-year-old cemented his status as China's most powerful leader since Chairman Mao at last year's Communist Party Congress. The twice-a-decade event saw his name and political theory enshrined in the party's constitution. The 13th National People's Congress is all but certain to pass the amendment when it meets on the 5th of March.
Alice Ekman, is this a turning point for China?
It's a confirmation of what we have been seeing over the last 5 years. Xi Jinping is a strong man. He has restructured institutions in the first years of his mandate. He has positioned his friends and close allies around him. He had promoted an anti-corruption movement, which is still ongoing, and which generate a form of fear within the party, a fear of being investigated, a fear of being denunciated by colleagues or other party cadres. And today he's promoting a new ideological framework that I think we could say is inspired by Mao. Mao era itself. When we read closely, recent communication that was published yesterday or today by Xinhua News Agency, the state news agency, there is clear mention, and I quote, of the need to build a great modern socialist country, and also the need to promote people's democratic dictatorship. So this term sounds strange to us, but actually they were a term directly used by Mao. The term, expression people's democratic dictatorship was explicitly used under Mao era. So to me, I see a continuity, but not between Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, but between Mao and Xi. At least I think now we have enough elements to draw a parallel without being too generalistic.
But how did we get to this point? Because that 1982 constitution was a reaction to Mao and the fact that perhaps that cult of personality went too far in the eyes of many Chinese.
Yeah, but not maybe in India, not in the eyes necessarily of Xi Jinping. It's very hard to understand Xi Jinping psychologically. He was himself a victim of the Cultural Revolution. He was sent down to countryside. So how did he react from that? What is his mindset? It's very hard to say. We were many analysts, raising question mark in 2012, saying what type of leader will Xi Jinping be? More conservative, more of a reformer? Will he open up further the economy or the political system? Now, first of all, we had a lot of opacity surrounding, the system, and opacity is still there because we didn't expect this decision, that was just mentioned in the report. But now we have enough evidence to say that he is conservative economically and politically. Politically, he has reinforced, the teaching of Marxist-Leninism. The practice that he has promoted, such as self-criticism and criticism, such as self-supervision, mutual supervision and mutual control within the party and outside the party, are direct legacy of the Mao era. So even if it's still hard to understand Xi Jinping's mindset, and draw a general and fine-tuned psychological analysis, we can say that he is a deep believer of socialism in the traditional sense, that he has a deep ambition for himself as a leader, not just for the coming years, but longer, because we don't know how much he will stay in power. Now he has a possibility to stay more than 2023, further on. But even if he stepped down by that time, if he decides to step down by that time, he has restructured institutions and influence, the decision-making process to such an extent that he could still be influential outside when stepping down. Deng Xiaoping was still influential when his remaining title was chairman of the Bridge Society of China. So, now we are trying to forecast who will be nominated next to him, next week, but independently of the nomination, he has restructured the party and institutions so much that his legacy will remain, I think, far beyond 2023.
Sun Yun, what's your thinking? What made it possible for Xi Jinping to lord over the rest of the Communist Party in this way?
Well, if we look at Xi Jinping's predecessor, look at Hu Jintao's 10 years, in China, that was regarded as a great decade of great inaction. So China got richer during that one decade, but China internationally was not regarded as the strong nation. The global status of China was on the rise, but then China was not regarded as a world leader or the peer of the United States. So I think in China, there had been this nationalism surge before Xi Jinping stepped into the Zhongnanhai and declared that I want to make China strong. Because you could arguably say that the 3 decades or the 34 years before Xi Jinping came into power, the 34 years of reform and opening up has made China a rich nation. But now Xi Jinping is making the declaration that I'm going to make China a strong nation as well. And that calling has been welcomed by China or by a lot of Chinese citizens. So if you look at China, Xi Jinping's domestic political agenda, the anti-corruption campaign has been vastly popular among people who are tired of the rampant corruption within the party and the government. So I think Xi Jinping has identified those issues that he could exploit to boost his personal popularity,
and have people,
and also at the same time wiping out his political enemies, so paving up the way to where he is today.
Paving the way to where he is today. Have people forgotten about the cult of personality under Mao?
I don't think people have forgotten about it. I see And I hear a lot of concerns from China, from Chinese people and Chinese intellectuals asking, is Xi going too far? That we understand that he has a strong personality and he has a lot of ambitions coming to the so-called rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. But is he pushing too fast? Is this premature? And is this going to lead us to where we were during the Cultural Revolution, where basically one-man rule led to the disaster of the history, in the history of the new China? So all those questions are being raised, but privately in China. Given the political climate, I don't think there are a lot of Chinese intellectuals or even scholars are able to raise those criticisms or questions in public, and that is very disconcerting.
Wu Fei, let me ask you, one of the criticisms I've read today is that his anti-corruption campaign has been so successful that it's, well, as Alice Ekman was saying, it's scared a lot of people within the party. Does he run the risk now of just being surrounded by sycophants, people who tell him how great he is all day, and therefore that will cloud his judgment going forward?
So my personal opinion that a lot of people just compare with Maoism, Mao Zedong's timing, but it's not quite suitable this time because, you know, after 30 years of Chinese economic reform, you know, a lot of wealth now already exists in China. For example, Chinese tourism influence the world, and the Chinese economic now takes the second position of the world. So that is a huge problem for Chinese. You think about how to exist our wealth, our money. For example, that's China was in the world, but from the there's a power of the national is not so good. So it's lots of Western country just join, enter in China. So Chinese as the colony.
We're starting to lose the connection a little bit. We're gonna Wu Fei, we're gonna try to call you back because we're losing the Skype connection there with Moscow. We'll try to reconnect. Apologies for that. Andre Lozikiuk-Petri, your thoughts, because it's not just anti-corruption. People are counting on Xi Jinping to make major reforms in sectors that interest you as an entrepreneur. Most notably banking, the way of doing business. Is this going to be an incentive to do so, or is this going to, well, mean that he can do whatever he wants?
Well, look, I think this is a definite answer to the big question that many of us asked since 2012, where a lot of people said, is he going to be a reformer after this basically lost decade for reform, but which was a very good time for foreign companies as well as for Chinese during Hu Jintao. For the 2 or 3 first years, many said, okay, he's trying to clean up the mess with his anti-corruption campaign, but we were not many that 2 or 3 years ago kind of came to the conclusion that what we're seeing today is that, no, this is going towards an authoritarian state, a state that is driven by nationalism, a country that I personally respect a lot, but this should be a massive wake-up call, especially for European and, of course, for the US, that China is not anymore a friendly partner. It's a partner that is looking for its interest first. So I think what happened today, I mean, Trump, a year ago, President Trump talked about America first. I think with this, clearly Xi Jinping is saying it's China first. And I think we Europeans should take all the consequences and forget all the romanticism we had about the Silk Road and all these nice plans which are coming out of China. I think it's really a wake-up call and a massive departure, if I may add, to Deng Xiaoping's. I mean, he had this famous sentence in Chinese called "Kao Guang Yang Hui," which means keep hiding, develop calmly, don't provoke, and don't show the rest of the world that China is rising. I don't know. I mean,
but you heard Sun Yun saying how that. But, excuse me, Andre. You heard Sun Yun saying how, you know, this more aggressive militant stance is popular in China.
Oh, in China, it's definitely popular. Like populism is popular everywhere in the world, and you know, Xi Jinping has been both you know, a leader who went through all these different training. He was a provincial governor. He was a central government official, so he had a training and an interior grooming like very, very few leaders in the world have. So he's definitely extremely capable. He's putting very capable people around him. There's a person that nobody has heard before, or no specialist has heard before, but that will become probably very popular or well-known, which is called Liu He, which is really the man behind the economic policies today in China. But the big question is, has ever in history a country survived when one man concentrates all that power, and obviously where a court around him is crowding? I personally, and that's my very personal opinion, I don't think this is good news for China, because China has been very, very successful with this consensus-based collegial leadership. We will see what happens in the future, but as we say, nobody is all-knower. So Xi Jinping will not make too many mistakes with the power.
Alice Ekman, do you agree that China's, well, losing some of its clout with this decision?
I don't know, because China is communicating more professionally abroad. So at the same time, you know, Xi Jinping is consolidating his power, but when he's giving speeches at Davos or somewhere else, he's softening his discourse so that this discourse becomes more appealing to a Western audience. What is sure, and what we can acknowledge today very clearly, is that Xi Jinping has ambition for the role of China in the world, you know, and Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, it was priority to economic development. China did not have the economic capabilities to play an important diplomatic role. Xi Jinping thinks now that China has such capabilities. Most of all, Xi Jinping believes that it's not only time to resist what he calls Western hostile forces, interference in China. That's what he means by it's not only time to resist democratization process or democratization influence, but it's time to fight back. That's it. It's time to promote in the world an alternative model of development and governance in which China, towards developing country in particular, but not only, and China position itself as an example.
Yeah, so what that fight back means is something we'll pick up on when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France24 Debate.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
For the pupils of Parkland High School in Florida, February 14th was a day that became a nightmare. Their generation is now in shock, but determined to make itself heard and put pressure on politicians.
We don't know how to be quiet. We're not silent. What he did woke up a new beginning. It woke up a whole new start. We are going to fight. We are going to cry. We are going to do nothing but make sure that gun control law is gone. We were ready. All of us were starting our new life. It was taken away from them. So we're taking away gun control from America.
Through the Never Again movement, can school children provoke a nationwide change in the way Americans think?
Reporters on France24 and France24.com. Middle East Matters, presented by Sanam Chantier.
Keep up to date on the latest from the Middle East. We bring you political, economic, and cultural events from the region in this weekly Middle Eastern program.
Middle East Matters on France24 and France24.com.
Sur France 24, la nuit, on est très fiers d'accompagner les Amériques dans leurs soirées, de voir l'Asie se réveiller, et on est là jusqu'à ce que Paris s'éveille.
France 24 es más que solo noticias. Es libertad, igualdad y actualidad. Nosotros damos un paso más allá, con información al momento para analizar, comprender, poner en perspectiva y debatir.
Sur France 24, L'Afrique, c'est chic.
In Live from Paris, our correspondents around the world keep you up to date.
Vous êtes déjà plusieurs millions et de plus en plus nombreux à suivre France 24 sur les réseaux sociaux.
من الطبيعي أن يكون شعارها الحرية وخاصة حرية التعبير في بلد حرية التعبير.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Russia announces daily 5-hour truces for the Syrian rebel enclave of Eastern Ghouta starting Tuesday. Eastern Ghouta, where the bombing continues, and so do accusations of chlorine gas attacks by Damascus. Yes to a customs union with the EU by spelling out his stance. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn ups the pressure on the ruling UK Conservatives to negotiate a soft Brexit. Germany's Christian Democrats widely approve a grand coalition with the Social Democrats, a deal the SPD still has to approve. That announcement, that result will come through on the weekend. The French government to scrap the special status for railroad engineers with an end to retirement at age 52. Rail unions respond by announcing strikes for next month. Kate Moody will have all the day's business. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France24 Debate. We're speaking on the day where, well, it's becoming more and more clear that term limits are going to be lifted for China's President Xi Jinping. He's 64 years old. It means he could be president of China for a long, long time. With us to talk about it, Alice Ekman, who's just published in French, La Chine dans le monde, China in the world, with other senior academics here in Paris.
7 of them.
7 of them in total. With us from Washington, Sun Yun, senior associate at the East Asia program for the Stimson Center think tank. From Moscow, journalism professor and commentator Wu Fei is with us, and from the Corsican city of Ajaccio, André Lozicu-Petri, founder of A Capital. Welcome back to all of you. Sun Yun, let me ask you a question. We were talking just before the break about what this change in power, what this change for China means. There's more and more talk of the return of the man who had been Xi Jinping's anti-corruption czar, Wang Qishan. Now, he is past the normal retirement age, but it sounds like he could be making a return as vice president.
Well, that is a speculation. First of all, the age limit on senior Chinese politicians is a tacit rule. It's actually not spelled out in either the Charter of the Chinese Communist Party or the Constitution of China. So the tacit rule is that if you are at the age of 68 by the time of the party congress, you're going to retire. But if you're at the age of 67, then you're eligible to stay for another 5 years. So for Wang Qishan, yes, he has definitely passed the age of 68. But the speculation is that he will be selected as vice president of China, and also this most recent indication of the constitutional change also lifts the limits of the terms for vice president as well of China. So we're looking at a situation that Wang Qishan will have another 5 years as Chinese vice president, and Xi Jinping is going to face not a limit for his term. And the speculation here is that Wang Qishan will be tasked with the important mission to handle U.S.-China relations, given his past experience under, for example, the Bush administration. He was in charge of the strategic and economic dialogue, and he has had vast experience fighting corruption in China in the past 5 years. So Wang Qishan is regarded as also a very capable man, also a very strong leader. And foreseeably, he will be carrying an important portfolio moving forward.
An important portfolio, which is how to deal with countries like the United States. And on that score, in the introduction to your book, you say something which is, well, actually, China is at the heart of what you consider an unstable region, Alice Ekman. Because there are these potential naval standoffs with all these territorial disputes with all the surrounding nations there.
Yeah, China is trying to reorganize the Asia-Pacific region because it's a very important region for what is called its core interests, including South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan issue, Hong Kong, among other issues. So for China, it's very important, Chinese diplomacy is very important to be proactive, to keep being at the initiative. So there is a shift not just in content, an adjustment not just in ambition, but also in methodology. Of Chinese diplomacy under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is very much at, yeah.
Does that heighten the chance of, some kind of a standoff? Like the kind we saw between, the tension we saw between China and Japan a few years back, over disputed islands near the Philippines.
I think behind all this regional flashpoint is growing rivalry between the US and China. The real point of tension is between US and China. We tend to underestimate how strong is the resentment of China toward the US, how strong is the competition, and how strong is the desire to bypass the US and become number one leader in the region, but also in a diversity of fields, so economic, financial, in terms of norms and standards as well. You have now China taking more initiative in the legal field, under the framework of its Belt and Road Initiative. So I think we're really now witnessing a competition of model of the governance, a competition of political system, a competition of values, we can say, a competition of definition. A significant amount of countries in the Asia-Pacific region are not talking about preserving a liberal order, or at least a special approach toward international law. And China considered that it's up to Beijing now to shape new standards, including legal standards, technical standards, and it should turn the page of Western influence in diversity of fields.
Wu Fei, do you agree that the rivalry between China and the U.S. can only grow?
No, I'm not agreeing with that because of China don't want to rival with U.S. as I know the information essentially. So they send another economist to U.S. right now for 5 days visiting. So, but because of recent 5 years, so China has serious trouble around China, from the Taiwan mainland China and Taiwan and South China Sea and South Korea and North Korea's problem at the Senkaku Island, for example, recent time available from the India and the border with China. So I think it's a very huge and a very serious challenge to the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. So I think that's the reason why Chinese people always worry about their wealthy, worry about their money. Because after 30 years, as I mentioned before, after 30 years reform, Chinese GDP already takes the second position in the world. But situation is just like the Qing dynasty. From the Qing dynasty, there's also strong economic, but from the political power, and other military power, they are not so strong. So same as recent time China, if Chinese leader was not strong enough, he cannot lead the Chinese military. So for example, military have his own business sometimes. So it's anti-corruption recent 2 years just carry on the military. So that is a serious corruption also exists in military. Yeah, so it's just like Qing dynasty, military just exists the drugs. So all the war between the West from Qing dynasty, we just lose all the war. So if the military not so strong, so we cannot control the military.
So
how about our wealth? So how about our money? So that's I think that's a serious problem for the Chinese people, right?
All right. So China, what you're saying is that needs to feel safer and bolstered is what you're saying. I want to turn now to one aspect of this that's happening at this particular point in time, and that is here in France. People over the weekend have been looking at China in a different light, Before visiting the big annual Paris Agriculture Fair this past weekend, France's president promised French farmers measures to prevent land from getting gobbled up on the sly by foreign investors. And by foreign investors, well, I guess you can read China. Locals express ambivalence. The farmers say they're happy about the cash injection, but feel dispossessed of their ancestral land. Now, the AFP news agency spoke to one Chinese billionaire who's bought 3,000 hectares in the wheat-growing center of France, and who asks, well, where's the problem?
When we invest in farms in France, it's the same as what the Germans or the English do. It boosts economic development. In the future, the Chinese bakery market will expand considerably. If the surface area of the land we bought is too small, it will not be enough. We intend to obtain most of the flour through French cooperation.
Andrei Lozakrug-Petri, is there a... we lost the connection, it seems. Andrei Lozakrug-Petri, you with us? No, all right.
Yes, I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
Are the Chinese buying French farmland? Is that a problem?
Look, my point I was making before was about the fact that I think that this much more authoritarian image that China gives creates these reactions that with no other country creates. Let's think about it. 3,000 hectares, that's less than 1/3,000 or 4,000 of France. So we are not talking about buying a big chunk of land. China is the 11th or 12th investor in France. But no other country creates this kind of pushback or reaction where even the president steps in because it creates a lot of fears. So my point is here to say is that I'm not so sure that the strategy of China of being much more assertive is actually bringing its a massive benefit. And I want to show as an example the attitude of Germany. Germany has been probably the most accommodating country to China because the systems export-driven are very similar. Since 2 years, the mentality towards China has shifted massively in all parties. And China is now seen as a rival or even as sometimes aggressive on the economic front, which was absolutely not the case in Germany, which is much less politicizing these things. So I'm not so sure that this stance is going to bring a lot of benefits to China. So that's my concern.
Yeah, by the way, we just in the past couple of hours have learned that the French state has stopped its initial plan to sell 10% of the airport in Toulouse to a Chinese consortium. Sun Yun, let me ask you your reaction to all of this. Basically, if Xi Jinping is strong, if he flexes his muscle, is that bad for business?
Bad for business in China or bad for business in other countries?
Bad for business with the rest of the world.
Well, here's the thing. China has the cash. And China has made it clear that it is willing to use its financial resources, aka its money, to buy its influence across the world. And that does not only include the developing countries where China has already established much influence. Now it is coming to the developed countries. In Europe, in North America, we all face this question that China is coming with cash and they're willing to buy things. But then the question to us is, are we willing to sell? I think for the immediate future, it will be imprudent for China to try to use their financial assets or try to use their monetary means to directly interfere with the politics of the recipient country. But we all know that when we deal with China, that's probably in the game. Just not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually somewhere down the road, China is going to say that we own this much financial assets in your country, and we don't like your position on, for example, human rights. We don't like your position on Dalai Lama, and we don't like your position on Taiwan. So we are going to mobilize the social influence in your country to change your policy course in a direction that is favorable to China. So the question for us is, are we willing to take that? I think for a lot of companies, they are concerned about their immediate profits. They're probably more eager to say yes to Chinese money than the government would be or than politicians would be, and certainly more than the intellectuals would be.
Alessandro?
Yeah, it's true that we are witnessing a competition of influence.
And take the example
very strong, well-coordinated Public diplomacy is now in place since Xi Jinping has come to power, and we can already notice it in Europe. China's position are well heard, not just pronounced.
Yeah, but is there going to be blowback? Is the question now? If Xi Jinping is seen to be too authoritarian or perhaps capable of throwing too much weight around?
You know, the question we are raising here in France are not necessarily raised in other countries which are facing much stronger economic difficulties and which have a different type of relationship with China. And in particular, in developing countries, Chinese model, or even a different type of model, at least a model with a strong state, a planned economy, is becoming appealing. So the competition of influence should be analyzed, taking into account the diversity of perception and local context, and how much the amount of effort China is putting in putting into question liberal order or liberal political system. You know, part of Chinese public diplomacy, talking point is to point at the weaknesses of what is called the West. So look, they were not able to catch up or to face the economic and financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Look at Europe, they are so divided. Look at the EU, it's such a complicated institution, overlap, etc. process. Look, we have a more efficient political and economic system, and you can learn from us. That's what this China is promoting a diversity of countries, including in some European countries. So I'm not even sure that the last change that we are witnessing here, about the mandate of Xi Jinping, etc., will necessarily change domestic perception in countries in which China has already invested massively.
Because that's one of the remarks, André Lozocoq-Piatri, that's been made in after hearing this news of the lifting of term limits for Xi Jinping, is that, well, just beyond China, we're just more globally in an era of a strongman, where strongmen are appealing.
Well, I think that's probably the positive that I take out of it, that I think for many Western leaders, and I know that in most of our Western countries, including in France, there has been a lot of politicians that were very attracted by the Chinese model and tried to influence, even from interior of the system of our democracies, saying, look, we should not be too tough to China. It's evolving towards our values. I hope this is a final wake-up call, and that these influences can be proven wrong. And it's competition of systems, and on that one, I completely agree with Alice. Is hopefully what is happening in China is showing that there is no system in history who has ever survived authoritarian without ending into a one-man rule. And unfortunately, never in history the one-man rule has ended well. So that's all the good I wish to my Chinese friends, is that it will not end like that. And I also hope that we in Europe, in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, where China is exerting a lot of influence, people will realize that these are not necessarily the European values that we are close to.
Well, Sun Yun, let me ask you about that, and also, being a strong man, and he is the strongest since Mao, that also makes you a magnet for complaints. We've seen it recently. Any kind of problem that takes place in China will now be systematically Xi Jinping's fault.
I think that's a tendency. If you want all the power, eventually you will be held responsible for all the powers and all the decisions that you have made. For example, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. There are a lot of complaints in China and a lot of problems that exist along the Belt and Road. And who do people blame? Well, eventually it's going to be on Xi Jinping's account, because that is his signature foreign policy initiative. And I think, the Chinese political system has the ability to adapt here and there and to blame the responsibility onto other actors. For example, if it fails in a country in Central Asia or in South Asia, they could blame it on the conspiracy by India to sabotage the Chinese Belt and Road, or blame it on other countries. And even within China, just call the Chinese companies to be insatiably greedy and blame the Chinese actors, local actors, for not following the corporate social responsibility or the rules of clean investment. So I think the Chinese system does have the ability to accommodate some of the blames and the responsibilities, but eventually it will be on Xi Jinping's account.
It'll be on his watch. Sun Yun, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I want to thank as well Wu Fei in Moscow, Andrei Lizakuk-Petri in Ajaccio, Alice Ekman. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
James, there was a sprinkling of dissent on social media in China.
Not everybody likes the idea of this. And just to take a look at some of the reservations being expressed, mostly it must be said by non-Chinese observers. You have Chris Creven on Twitter saying, bad news for the US, bad news for the world, bad news for China. This is just bad news as far as he's concerned. Xi Jinping's announcement that he's going to do away with that 2-term limit. Well, it wasn't his announcement, but seriously important and seriously bad news for China and the world. This means Xi Jinping is going all the way with the Leninist gamble, which has always failed in the past. That's one China observer, Timothy Garton-Ash. I think that the Xi Jinping news is bad. You're seeing a theme here. With regional and global stability, personalist regimes initiate more conflicts than do dictatorships based on institutionalized single parties. And a reference there to a book, actually, that seems to go into that in a lot more depth by Jessica Weeks. What else do we have? Analysts said ending the 2-term limit gives the strongest indication yet that Xi will stay in power longer than his recent predecessors at a time when the leadership was fixated on stability. So stability seems to be the key priority here.
Yeah, short-term good, long-term...
Right.
Not so good.
Perhaps not so good.
Chinese state media have been tweeting.
That's right. Of course, Chinese people can't tweet from within China, but there is an exception for media such as China Daily, and really they're just putting forth Xi Jinping's argument. It's his having stressed the important role of the Constitution. So it's interesting that they're kind of flouting that there is an attempt to reform the Constitution to allow for a 3-term rule, but yet somehow it's being spun as the important role of the Constitution and protecting the Constitution, which seems a little bit like of an interesting way of spinning it. Similarly, coming from China Xinhua News, no organisation or individual has the power to overstep the Constitution or the law. Unless you find a way of reforming it, I suppose. This is an interesting fact, a fun fact that Forbes pulled out of the archives. He was first elected in 2013 by a vote of 2,952 to 1, and it's certain to be re-elected this year. Speculation is that the one vote against Xi Jinping in 2013 secret ballot was from Xi Jinping himself, and he may have cast the vote as a form of democratic window dressing.
All right, so the Chinese can't go on Twitter, but they can go on Weibo.
That's right. I can't decipher Weibo, so I'm relying on people, what would you say, harvesting the best of Weibo for...
Winnie the Pooh is back.
Winnie the Pooh is back. This is an image of Winnie the Pooh dressed as a monarch.
So that's the code for Xi Jinping.
Right, apparently often used as code for Xi. There is maybe some similarity, although... perhaps not. I mean, he isn't, human being, cartoon bear. Could have expected this, but still pretty creative. First images of King Winnie surfacing on Weibo in response to Xi's potential indefinite rule. And if we're having comparisons to Winnie the Pooh as a king, there are also, some references to emperors. This is nuts, as one Twitter user says. Emperor stocks soar in China as Xi cleared for indefinite reign. Chinese speculators are pounced on stocks with emperor in their name on Monday after the ruling Communist Party set the stage for President Xi Jinping to stay in office. So King Pooh comparisons, emperor references, and just to kind of finish it up, The Guardian in the UK referred to him as the Putin of the East. So I suppose we're seeing some kind of a red kind of a line going through all of that, or kind of a common thread, if you like. So he was referred to as the Putin of the East in today's Guardian.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creed. And I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 Debate.